Okay, so why don't we get started? So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our next installment of these British comic plays. I hope you're enjoying them. I hope you're having a chance to read them and even watch them. I read this one for the first time this week, and I actually watched it. It was BBC television series from the early '70s. It's and it's quite funny. I hope you found it funny yourself. Uh, just a quick thing before I turn it over to Mark, and then we'll get going. On the literary front, for those of you who are able to come to the library, we started a series this past Monday, and we've got two more to go next Tuesday because of the holiday, and then the following Monday with Barb Jens, who was the poet laureate of Ridgefield for several years, and she's doing a poetry series with us. That's in person in the library only, but you can certainly go sign up for it and come. It's about poetry and performance. It's an interesting take on a literary subject. And then we are starting a series with Judson Scruton, who many of you know, and he has moved, as some of you know, to North Carolina. We're going to start another series with him on Thursday morning, October 31. That's going to be a hybrid. So if you can come to the library, we're going to have people in person in the usual room, but we're going to have Judson on Zoom and accessibility by Zoom for people that can't get there or don't live in the area. So that's on the library's website calendar right now. Feel free to go sign up for that one also. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. And thank you also for having me back. Thank you, everyone, for attending and possibly attending more than one of these. We're on the third of sixth. Last time I mentioned sentimental comedy, and Michael corrected me because I had this play and next time's play reversed. I had forgotten that I decided to not do a sentimental comedy with you as part of this series because they're not funny and they have not stood the test of time. And so instead, we're doing two comedies, this one tonight by Goldsmith and 2 weeks from now by Sheridan, that are called laughing comedies. Seems redundant, but I'll just say briefly, repeating some of what I said last time, that after the Puritans took over and then Restoration comedy restored non-Puritans to control the government, the plays like The Country Wife were quite bawdy and even lecherous and very rambunctious, and they played well for a short time, but then they were an embarrassment. And what followed was what came to be called sentimental comedy, the theory being that comedy should not poke fun at people. Comedy should take people who have flaws and gently correct them, and it should invest them with greater feeling. And so it was partly the beginning of the romantic sense that emotions mattered, and they were quite boring, and they weren't meant to be laugh out loud funny. By contrast, an essay appeared around the time that Goldsmith was flourishing. He wrote prose and poetry. He was also an apothecary's assistant, and he was a Grub Street hack writer, was very prolific in his short lifetime. An essay was written that some people think he wrote, talking about the advantages of so-called laughing comedy over sentimental comedy. So we're doing two laughing comedies. They are both comedies of manners. And I'm going to say, as I mentioned last time, a few things to set the table with historical and critical context, and hope that those of you who've read or seen this play have found it congenial enough, whether you liked it or not, to talk about it as a reading experience in the 21st century, because unlike the sentimental comedies and unlike The Country Wife, She Stoops to Conquer has been popular ever since it was first produced in 1773. So the first thing I'll say that when Michael said maybe actually see the play, it's certainly true that it's better to see a play than only read it. And to generalize, it's probably true that to see the physical setup of a stage is more helpful in the average comedy, there are always going to be exceptions, than in the average tragedy. And part of that has to do with comedies being comedies of circumstance rather than of character. So you can imagine the way this could be staged. So the entrances and exits of the people who are wearing the right or wrong clothes matters. One of the brilliant things that I think Goldsmith did is he didn't create twins as in Twelfth Night. He created a man who has a social disorder that makes him two people socially. And through an extraordinary contrivance that's set up by the end of the first act, Mr. Hardcastle likes things old, including his daughter's um, fashions, and it's worked out that she can dress fashionably in the morning and a blow cast in the evening, and that, of course, is important. In addition, there is a stepson. They're almost never good news in a play, especially a comedy. You know that he's not a positive character when you see his name. Not only the Lumpkin, which is a giveaway, but Hastings has the name George, and father and son Marlowe have the name Charles. Good English names, good monarchical names. Tony is not quite the same resonance. And you know that Tony Lumpkin is not going to be a high-born background or bearing. And this allows me to comment that one of the holdovers, more so in drama than in novels, is the use of names that are obviously meant to be comic or point to someone's character. So Aunt Pedigree is an improbable name, but it happens in comedy. Sometimes we'll have novels into the 19th and even 20th century give obviously comic or satiric names to characters, but it's much more common in drama. Another thing about drama and preferring to see it staged, first of all, it's always best to see a play staged because someone else is directing it for you, and that's helpful. Also, one of the things that's very important when you read a play and demanding is when someone's talking, you have to be mindful of who's still on stage. And if you're not paying attention to who exits and who exits, that can be confusing because often what is said on stage, even if it's not meant for someone else's hearing, or even if the other person on stage is not eavesdropping, it matters that they could have heard it, or it matters that when this is being said, when A is talking to B, B is aware that C is also on stage. That's a very hard thing to do by your own calculation. The other thing I'll say is that generally comedy depends much more on physical actions on stage and the stage setup than drama. Now there are than tragedy. There are all kinds of dramas, there are all kinds of exceptions. But a very old device in both tragedy and comedy is the one where somebody or some people are hidden behind a screen. And in most English homes, certainly well-to-do homes, there's no dearth of screens of different kinds for ornamentation, for protection, for privacy. Someone is behind a screen watching a scene unfold, usually to prove something, and their presence is not known to everybody that they're watching. It's an important element in Hamlet, where Claudius and Polonius agree to watch Hamlet and Ophelia interact to see if Polonius is right that Hamlet's not crazy except for his daughter. If you were staging this, one advantage of the screen, when at the end Hardcastle and his friend hide behind the screen, is if you put the screen at right angles so that the audience can see both sides of the people in the screen, but they can't see each other, then a lot of comic stuff can be done with hyperbolic interactions, facial expressions, jumping up and down or keeping the other one quiet. You can get a lot of hay out of having hidden characters from other people on stage, but not from the audience. So again, the idea of a holdover of comic names, the idea of the physicality of most comedies as contrasted to the physicality of most dramas. And of course, This is also, as is next time's play, a comedy of manners, a comedy that pokes fun at highborn people. So even though Marlowe is eventually redeemed, and even though his quirk may not be a character flaw, it may be. It may be that the idea that when he is with people, women below his station, he is lecherous, does not speak well for him. But he's redeemed at the end, the confusion is relieved, and he's going to be married, which is the end result of most comedies. Remember, I mentioned in the very first session that comedies look at human beings as social creatures, and it considers them not as biological creatures. The main fact of your biological life is that you will die. Tragedy is aware of that fact and is concerned about how it can find some meaning or nobility in our mortality. And so it tends to concentrate on characters in their biological relations. Hamlet, father and son, King Lear and his daughters, and so on. Comedy takes a different view and says that in many situations of social life, things get better after a while. The while might require a new generation, and so many comedies end with marriage or marriages in the understanding that the new generation will renew not individual people who are mortal and die, but will keep society going. So there's a quite serious business in most comedies, certainly Shakespearean comedies, about the importance of marriage as a social boon. But still, what one thing comedy does is it tries to puncture the hypocritical. Mr. Hardcastle is a good old-fashioned man with a good old-fashioned name. His wife, who was married before, which may not be an indictment of her character, but she's not such a good person. She's keeping her son in the dark. She's eager to keep jewels that are not hers to keep. And she is the rare example of a female character of a certain age who is severely criticized. She's the bad wife. Mr. Hardcastle is the good husband. Again, with the names, they're not always so obvious as Pedigree and Lumpkin. Kate has the surname, the first name of a romantic heroine. Kate is a name. If you knew that the two young women in this play were Kate and Constance, you would know that Kate is the leading lady and Constance is the B-side of that story. Constance is good, but Kate is personable and the heroine. I know this isn't a particularly high-level reference, but on Gilligan's Island, the two young single women are Marianne and Ginger. One is a girl next door and one is a movie star. You don't have to guess which is which. The girl next door is Marianne and the movie star is Ginger. Comedies don't apologize for using those kinds of codes. And so this is the first of several comedy of manners we're going to be looking at. The Importance of Being Earnest is a great example of a comedy of manners. One of the things the theater-paying public like to see is well-born people being made fun of. So the idea that Marlowe Jr. is making a fool of himself, and that's known to several characters in the play, but not to him, is itself cause for enjoyment of the average 18th century theatergoer. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to you is that it is a fact of English literature that most readers, whether high school and college students or adult readers, feel more of a connection to 16th century literature, especially Shakespeare, than they do to most 18th century literature. With some exceptions like Gulliver's Travels or the 18th century novel, 18th century poetry, 18th century prose that are not novels, 18th century plays before the second half of the century are not much cultivated by modern readers. For that matter, neither are 18th century novels. So Jane Austen, Dickens will have multiple examples, multiple novels turned into movies, sometimes within a few years of each other, the same novel. And you won't see novels of um, Tristram Shandy or Moll Flanders or even Robinson Crusoe. Uh, it's partly because the 18th century is pre-romantic. It has not yet swung the pendulum back to where people think that emotional life is an important constituent of the human identity. They think that humans are mainly sensible creatures, common sense, like in Paine's call to the support of the American Revolution, and the American enterprise was based on Enlightenment values of um, being endowed with inalienable rights. Well, that love of reason doesn't hold on so well when you're talking about literature. So 16th century literature is generally thought to be more conducive to 21st and 20th century taste. Even 17th century literature, which embraced a kind of wit and ornamentation. If you read the work of Marvell or Herbert or Donne, you know that they seem more modern. The 18th century seems to be a kind of gap, and you have to get over that to the 19th century when once again people seem to be constituted of having personalities that are partly emotional. So having said that, I'm hoping that enough of you have read the play and can talk about your opinion of this question. What is it like to read or possibly reread this very old play, hundreds of years old, um, as a reading experience? How did you find it as something to read for enjoyment? This is a study in the survey, but it's a survey of comedies. These comedies, and for the rest of the series, are meant to be funny. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Michael to direct traffic.
Okay, folks, you know the drill. So Q&A box, questions, comments, responsive to what Mark was just saying, and we'll give you a minute for that. Uh, it probably goes with what Mark was saying about watching a play or seeing a play. That I found it clever and at times funny when I read it, and when I watched it, I found it clever, but I also was laughing out loud at times. And I think that had a lot to do with the direction, the staging, and the fact that the visualization was being done for me. So, Mark, we got a comment. I watched a filmed stage performance on YouTube after reading the play. When reading the play, I thought Tony was malicious and difficult to understand his motivations. I was surprised that in the stage performance, Tony was a lot funnier and a lot more likable.
Yeah. So I want to say I hope that's not surprising to you. Um, we all know, we've all seen a TV show or an episode of anything or a play or a movie in which having this person play that role as compared to that person play the role makes all the difference. Even if it's not a matter of your interpretation of the part, it can be the reputation that actress or actor has outside of the movie. You're well disposed to so and so or so and so. It can be their actual look, either in terms of attractiveness or suitability for the part. And we all know that a little gesture or body language movement can make or break, especially a comic bit. And so the visualization of comedy, you can imagine how an actor who is a talented actor could manage when the two men are observing what's going on behind the screen, or when Constance and Hastings have to hide their elopement. How are they signaling to the audience that they're truly lovers, that they are going to be married even if they have to elope? That's a matter for the actors, the director, sometimes the whole production company.
Okay, so we got a couple of comments that I'm going to kind of combine because they may be kind of related. And Shannon said, we read this aloud as well, and we found the language was easier to follow. And the other comment was, I liked She Stoops to
Easier to follow, you mean when you read it?
reading it out loud.
Yes, yes. I
And then
always
this,
recommend that for anything.
and the other related comment, I think related, is that I like She Stoops to Conquer and thought it much more enjoyable than The Country Wife. The humor seemed much more accessible.
Yeah. So that's a long list of people who would agree with you. I mentioned at the first meeting that it's the nature of a survey that it's going to be uneven terrain. There are two general ways you can consider literature. I'm talking very generally. You can either do a topographical, that is, look at the lay of the land from Shakespeare to Michael Frayn and have a kind of sense of what the land looks like on the surface, even though we're talking about these individual plays. Or you can study literature geologically. I'm sorry, I'm battling a very bad headache tonight, so excuse me if I'm stammering. That is, you can take a period of literature and you can delve down into what makes Elizabethan art, literature, music, drama, what it is, and not worry about the lay of the land, but go mining for depth. Those are both perfectly accessible, perfectly acceptable ways of talking about literature, of the many ways there are. This is a survey that is going over the terrain. And I mentioned in the first meeting that Twelfth Night is funny. It's not laugh out loud funny the way comedies of manners are, but it's funny. It also is romantic in that there's real love in the play, and that helps a romantic comedy, of course. Not so The Country Wife, not so had we done sentimental comedies. But here again, whether you think there's actual love in the major plot of Kate and Marlowe, it's clear that Hastings and Constance are committed to each other and that their relationship is not just convenient or money grubbing. And that's always good in a comedy. And it does poke fun, as I've said more than once, at the upper classes. We will return to that in The Importance of Being Earnest, not to the real love. There's not much real love in The Importance of Being Earnest, partly because Wilde's not interested in that for comic reasons. Also, he was an all but open homosexual and wasn't inclined to invest a lot of his creative energy in heterosexual relationships. But it is very much a skewering of upper classes. Noise is Off is a kind of wide open farce, and we'll talk more about that as we get closer. But yes, I think whoever just said that comment, I think most people would find that the Stoops to Conquer is much more accessible than most any play, comic play written between Shakespeare and it.
Yeah, interesting. And another comment we have is from Jean. I just found this and the previous play is totally delightful, especially with Country Wife and She Stoops. I am just constantly reminded of screwball comedies and the Marx Brothers. It all seems so modern. And I'll just throw in there that after your last session, Mark, I actually watched Night at the Opera again because
Yeah,
of the scene you referred to, and it was absolutely hilarious. And I
two
could
hard-boiled eggs. Yes.
right. But the point that Gene's making is that this seems so modern in the context of relatively modern movies like from the Marx Brothers
Yeah,
is
yeah. So I think that's my friend Jean Laganza. Is that
yeah
Jean Laganza? Hi, Jean. So one reason they seem modern, I'm not sure I think of Country Wife as so modern, but I certainly think of She Stoops to Conquer, is that there's something universal about comedy. And whether the Marx Brothers are doing something in the 20s and 30s, or whether Mel Brooks is doing a movie in the 1990s, comedy has a kind of universal appeal, even going back to the Greeks. It's not necessarily culturally dependent, although there can be cultural markers for them. Let me also say that one of the things about visualization in comedy is we've all seen the episode in one or another movie where characters, sometimes the Three Stooges, sometimes the Marx Brothers, sometimes the Keystone Cops, are running in a hallway and opening and closing doors so that no two people are in the hallway at the same time, right? They're chasing each other. Someone goes into a door, someone comes out of the door, sees the other person go in, and for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, there is this ballet of movement that is all visual. There's no language. You don't even need to know if you came in the middle of the scene, who's looking for whom. It's intrinsically interesting. Whereas if it were a drama and the issue was who's got what and who's trying to get the what from that person, you wouldn't have the same, I can just sit here and watch this without knowing what's going on. The same thing's true that many comedies have long patches of no dialogue, especially movie comedies, because the action takes care of itself. And to the woman, I think it was a woman who said, yes, reading the plays out loud. I want to say that one advantage to reading drama out loud is you're dramatizing it. You're turning it into someone speaking a role, even if you're not an actor. Reading poetry or short prose out loud keeps you honest, because we know that even attentive readers who are not falling asleep as they read, you know who you are, they skip words unintentionally, or they see that there's a preposition, he walked down the street, and they just see he walked down and they don't pay attention. They know that he's walking down something, but it may not be the street. It may be an alleyway. It may be a place with a name, and that turns out to be important to the novel you're reading. And so it's good practice for attentiveness to read out loud. Also, we don't read enough in the 21st century. That is out loud. Reading is becoming a lost art in younger people. It's good to appreciate the literature as sound, not just as marks on a page.
Yep. So that's it for the comments so far. If you want to continue or
So I want to ask what people think of this. In the first act of the play, a number of improbable things are being set up. It's not improbable that a woman is doting on the son from her first marriage. It's not improbable that he is not a good person in the sense of uh, being marriageable or a catch for somebody. It's a little more improbable that Charles Marlowe has a split personality relative to what kind of women he's talking to, but not completely improbable. It is stretching it to say that Mr. Hardcastle likes old things, and so much so that he wants his daughter to dress in the old fashions in the evening and allows her to dress fashionably early in the day. Now, anyone seeing the play who knows it's a comedy, even if they know nothing about the plot, even if they don't have a playbill, hears that description and knows that a play called She Stoops to Conquer, and maybe with the subtitle Mistakes of the Night, realizes that that's going to be important to the way the play is set up. If you add to that the mischievous Tony misinforms the father and son Marlowes that the house is an inn, you have another play on class consciousness. It's one of those things where if you accept all those premises, and I certainly think the one about Kate dressing two different ways is far-fetched, but we allow for lots of things in comedy, then once you accept all that, the rest follows. Hilarity ensues. I remember that I had a social science teacher in high school who, on Jewish holy days, when the Jewish students didn't have to come to class, but those of us who are non-Jews did, he wouldn't teach the regular lesson. He couldn't because the class wasn't full. He would tell us something interesting about science or nature or history. And someone asked him if he could explain, this is going to be brief, ladies and gentlemen, how planes fly. And he said, well, we first have to accept that the shape of a wing makes a greater pressure below the wing than above it. It holds it up. Okay, we'll accept that. You don't have time to explain. Okay. And you have to basically accept the principle of thrust. And he said something brief, and then drag. He said, if you accept all that, then planes can fly. And I thought to myself, well, you didn't explain anything except all these things, and flying follows. You accept that all these improbable things or variously probable, improbable things in the play are operating, and you have a comedy. You have a pretty smart comedy and a funny comedy. I have seen this been performed in amateur productions and have found it very, very funny. I've never seen a movie of it, but I have seen a play version of it that was also quite good. And of course, I've read it several times. So does anyone have a comment about the buy-in required of the reader or spectator of these anomalous things that set the stage in the first act? It's a 5-act comedy. Some comedies are 3 acts, but more commonly they're 5 acts. And so a lot goes on. How did you find it as, again, a reader in the 21st century, and not even the early 21st century anymore? How did you find that setup that is clearly signaling what's going to follow?
All right, we'll give them a minute for that. In the meantime, we got a couple of other comments. One came in right when we were finishing the last section, and Desmond's comment was that not only is the humor modern, but modern in language also. The English language has come a long way since Shakespeare, and the grammar, spelling, and vocabulary in this are not far from what we read today.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And then another comment. You want
To say Shakespeare's day, how you spelled anything was a matter of personal decision. Shakespeare has several signatures. We have signatures, and he spells his name differently in different signatures. And it was considered part of your style to spell certain ways the way you wanted. And so until it was codified through dictionaries, and the idea was that proper spelling was an indication of your social value, people could spell and use words very differently from one another.
Sure. And then Paul put a comment in the end, does Marlowe regret his condescension to lower class people, or just being fooled and making embarrassing mistakes?
Well, let me ask you, did you see any evidence of his being contrite about his mistake beyond Kate? The person who's asking that question.
Yeah. We'll give him a second to.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, that's a question I think for any viewer. I don't remember his showing any sense of being really rehabilitated. I think the play treats his disorder as comic only, not generally a character flaw. And it's possible that his recognizing that the person he was treating badly is the same woman he now is in love with is going to have a change of heart more broadly. But I don't think the play cares much about the reclamation of his character. They just want to get things sorted out, corrected. Kate know that she's in love with a man who's worthy of being loved. And again, it's always true that the B couple, the Constance Tony, are more, their love is more obvious, but they are less interesting. It's always this way in a Jane Austen novel. The Binghams, who are married before Pride and Prejudice begins, they're a good married couple, but they're not going to have a novel written about them because they're boring. They're the B couple. They're the the Fred and Ethel Mertz. The A couple is going to be more interesting, more tempestuous, perhaps, more wrong-headed, but more interesting for the purposes of the plot. And that's what Kate and Charles are.
And Paul did come back agreeing with you. He also did not really see evidence of contriteness on Marlowe's part.
Tragedies are long-reaching. So when something happens in a tragedy, like the murder of Claudius and the deaths of several other people, and Hamlet is dying, when he says to Horatio, report my cause aright to the unsatisfied, tell people what I did and why. And when in the play Fortinbras, the Prince of Norway, comes into Denmark because he thinks they may have to take it over. What's happened in Denmark has consequences for future generations. It's not talked about in detail, but it's hinted at. That's not generally true of comedies. And in general, comedies don't spend a lot of time thinking about what happens next. So comic novels, comic plays end with the wedding, not with the marriage. And I have said before, maybe even to this group, that when you do continental novels, French novels, German, Italian novels, they don't end with the marriage. They begin with the marriage. And the marriage is not a happy ending. It's a complicated beginning. So you have many novels, Therese Raquin, Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, where the marriage is the starting point and they're interested in how the marriage goes wrong. The reason there's this difference between English plots in the 18th and 19th century and those others is that England is a Protestant country. Quite seriously, they believe in the reclamation of individuals through overcoming obstacles, and they believe, in the same way the continental novelists believe, that marriage is a sacred act. But they have a different opinion, the English do, of character. And the French and the Russian and Italian in particular are interested in how marriage is not a confirmation of good character, which is what it is in Jane Austen. Good people marry other good people. That's the end of it. You're not going to know what kids they have. You're not going to know what they did next year. Jane Austen does not care to tell you. But in continental novels, it's not true that the marriage is necessarily a confirmation of good character. It might, in fact, be a testing of character. And because these novelists, the ones like Tolstoy and Flaubert and Stendhal, are interested in the complications of character and tragedy. And those novels are very darkly tragic about the fate of the wives in the novels.
So, in response to the last question you threw out about the experience of buying into the I guess the context of what's going on in the play, Susan's comment was that she sees it as a version of world building.
Of world building?
World building.
Does she say more? I can guess what that means, but does she say more about that?
That's the comment. Maybe she can put another couple
Susan,
of
would you be
cents.
willing to add a phrase to what you mean by world building? And as we wait, I want to say, I think it's educational for any reader if you're reading in a group, if you and your partner, if you and your roommate, you and your children decide to read a novel together, if one of the things you discuss is, does this seem credible about how people are? Now, some genres are not about credit. If it's a farce, it's a farce. But if you're reading a realistic novel, it's interesting to talk to other people who are reading with you if you're not in a reading group like this or a class, to say, does it seem realistic to you that such a person would do such a thing? Because we all have different standards of realism. I know some people who really exist who seem completely unrealistic and improbable to me. I know real people that if they were in a movie, I'd say that's nobody acts like that, but they do.
Yeah. And we had a comment that it's hard to accept Kate's disguise as a maid, but I guess on stage an actress can use the bonnet, the dress, the body movements to deceive Marlowe.
Well, remember, I think the stage directions make it clear that when she's Kate, he's so shy he doesn't look her full in the face. And so I'm pretty sure that's how I've seen it performed, and that's how I would read it. That we're supposed to understand that he's so flummoxed by upper class women that he never actually appreciates what she looks like. And it's only when he sees her with her regular face, but in different garb, that he's looking at her. But of course, he has this bias against working class women. And of course, the title of the play is that this highborn woman is lowering herself in order to conquer the man. Some people thought that that was not the best title for it and preferred the mistakes of a knight. There was but it mainly gets published with both titles, but the main one being She Stoops to Conquer. Certainly a resonant title. And there was a sequel that wasn't very successful involving Tony Lumpkin, I think on the thinking that he was the most interesting character in the play for comedy. But to extend the point made earlier about whether Tony is a unpleasant character or is a character that adds some vitality to the play, that's one of the issues when you have a prankster, or the Middle Ages called it the disruptor of revels. That's what Malvolio is. Malvolio is dyspeptic. He's ill-willed in Twelfth Night. That's what his name means. He doesn't like other people having a good time. You may know the quotation from Mencken where the definition of a Baptist is someone who worries that someone somewhere is having a good time. You don't want people to have fun. You can imagine, with no change in the dialogue of the play, no change in the plot or actions of the play, that an actor could play that as a kind of smartass, that's a literary term, that is quite engaging in the way that we like movies in which someone is wisecracking and clever, as long as they don't cross the lines of what's acceptable. Or you can imagine him being a lumpy, stupid, he can't read, that's important to the plot, and maybe ill-willed person without a change in a single word of the dialogue. That's what interpretation is on stage.
Yeah. So Susan came back elaborating on world building. As a setup in any piece of fiction that has rules different from standard reality, it
Yeah.
is necessary to create the rules of the world. In a dystopia or a fantasy world, this might be very complex. In other works, there are fewer variations.
Yeah. So, Susan, thank you for being patient with me. That's what I would have guessed, but I didn't want to assume that. Yes, I think we're to see that what that first act does is it says the world you're going to enter is this world. And what is it? It's a world in which people can be other than what they seem, and not for being duplicitous. Marlowe doesn't intend to be duplicitous. And they can be other than what they seem because things have, someone has misled them. So Mr. Hardcastle is mistreated because the Marlowes have been misinformed. Or you can accept that this is a play that is very class conscious, from the whole notion of Hardcastle being insulted, that his old home, his old manor home, is mistaken for an inn. Obviously, if he didn't have an old home, obviously, if he kept up with the town sense of fashion, no one would make that mistake. They wouldn't see this as an old inn, they'd see it as a new contemporary home. So that's also part of the plot. I do think that keys us, what Susan's talking about, that the premise that this is going to be a play that is extremely attentive to class issues.
Yeah. So Kate says the contrivance that I found curious was that Mrs. Hardcastle is the mother of both Tony and Kate, but she focuses all her attention on Tony. I was able to let this go and then found the play very funny.
Yeah, she's stepmother to Kate, and I have no axe to grind with stepmothers, but I think it's important to answer your own comment to say she's mother to Tony and stepmother to Kate. And so she dotes on Tony. She's fond of him, but not fond enough to give him an education. She's fond of him, but not fond enough to let him have his own money. And I think we're to understand that she has no particular relationship with Kate. And I'm not making a comment on parents and step-parents, but it's significant in the play that the difference in treatment is one is her own child by birth and the other one's a child by marriage.
Right. So Kelly says, your question about realism in novels really strikes a note with me. I can't tell you how many books I've simply put down because of their fatal flaw, which is that nobody would do what just happened.
Right.
I no longer let novelists rely on a cheap trick that is totally unbelievable. I just let the book go. And then she followed up a minute later with, in this novel, the unrealistic events and characterizations weren't so extreme.
In this play, she's talking about today's play.
Yes,
Yeah, okay. And who's that? Who made that comment?
Kelly.
So Kelly, again, if you'd be willing to come back with another sentence or two, can you think of a work of literature that is well known enough that some of us might know it, that you think has one of those fatal flaws of that's just not credible? And while we wait for that, I want to say, people have different standards for what is credible. And I'm not kidding when I say, and I think this is true of all of us, I think we all know people who are absolutely real in our own experience, who, if you told the story of things they've done to people who didn't know them, would swear that you were making it up. That no, people don't act that way. Turns out people act a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And while we're waiting for that, we had another comment on the realism question. Was there a big discrepancy between how normal people were courting at that time versus what we're seeing in this play and prior ones we've covered? Wondering if the audience might have idealized these actors and situations shown on stage. Are they unreal, unattainable circumstances? Could women have actually had some say in whom they married based on love, for example? Uh, I assume it must have been based somewhat on class or
Yeah.
city, country.
So we have to remember that this is a play about upper class people. It's given away in She Stoops. We understand that the Hardcastles may not be fashionable, but they have an estate, they have money. Tony has money. Um, I don't know um, George Hastings' background in terms of finances, but he's a friend of um, uh, Charles and is probably pretty well to do. We understand that Kate is well born, so is Constance in her own way. So in that sense, this is not the everyday people. They're in the country, but they're in the country because Mr. Hardcastle eschews the modernity of the city. They may not be old money, but they're not the average person sitting in the theater. And so I will say in general, I don't think contemporary audiences in the 18th century are going to comedies to see themselves reflected. They want to see the puncturing of the pompous, or at least the ridiculing of the pompous. I don't think most of the people in the theater are imagining they're going to see people in a play like this who are like them.
Yeah. And
And
we have another,
to be earnest, the characters in that play are so rarefied, cucumber sandwiches and a butler and a well-to-do clothing and manners, a kind of hyper class consciousness in that play that people know that they're spectating how the other half lives when they see that play.
and Jean thought that Kate's was just too ready to accommodate her father's arranged marriage. Uh, he's this, he's fine, he's that, he's handsome, etc. But she could have been much less accommodating. But I think that would then have been another plot.
Wait, you have something against marriage, Gene? You have something against a funny comedy? I think we're supposed to understand that she's taken not just by his handsomeness, but by the fact that he's so pathetic in his being flummoxed that when she realizes what his issue is, in the same way that she might censor him for his ill treatment of lower class women, I think she's intrigued by the fact that he is sensitive enough that he's intimidated by, I'll say, good-looking upper-class women. I'll also say, and whether you're in the audience, whether those of you in the audience are married or not married, single or divorced, there are marriages and there are marriages. People marry for lots of different reasons.
Yeah. And Janet has added there is some nuance to Tony's character in that he purloins his mother's jewels to facilitate the elopement of Constance and her beau. For me, this adds to believability in that a thoroughly rotten character strains credulity even more than a buffoon.
Right, right. Also, one of the mainstays of comedies, certainly dramas, and sometimes also straight plays, is the family jewels. And I mean the actual jewels, not parts of your body. That the idea of the MacGuffin, what Hitchcock called the MacGuffin, that there's something that may not have intrinsic value, but possession of it is important. Uh, that's a mainstay. The Moonstone, one of the great novels in the 19th century by Wilkie Collins, depends upon what happened to a precious stone that was taken from a temple in India and is stolen from a manor house in the middle of the night, just before the princess, quote unquote, the highborn woman, is going to be married. And it sets the novel, the plot in gear, that where is this diamond. Trollope wrote a novel called The Eustace Diamonds that has the same thing. These jewels become a propeller of the plot. And that's very much from English society reality, that often a family's future would depend on which child inherited the actual family jewels.
Okay. And Desmond has mentioned that presumably Samuel Johnson saw this play in London as it was originally staged, and I think that he would have enjoyed it.
Oh, who is that who said that?
Desmond.
Desmond, you'll be glad to know that Samuel Johnson loved it, reported that he loved it, and wrote praise of it that said something along the ways of, can't think of any play that does better what a comedy should do, which is make an audience merry. Samuel Johnson also took it upon himself as a friend of Goldsmith to write the inscription on his memorial, which was destroyed in the air raids of 1941, but then rebuilt. Samuel Johnson was a friend, supporter, and admirer of Oliver Goldsmith, and he loved this play.
Great.
Samuel Johnson and Joshua Reynolds and Oliver Goldsmith and people I'm forgetting right now were members of what was called the Club, writers, historians, artists, essayists, poets, of educated, literate men, cultured men who were a sort of drinking, eating group, the Club. And Goldsmith, who was constantly in debt, for one thing, he gambled badly. He died early because he misdiagnosed his own ailment and died of a kidney infection that he could have had treated, they think. Anyway, Samuel Johnson, who was the arbiter of taste in 18th century London, was a great fan of Goldsmith and the play.
Perfect.
And Goldsmith was very well known for a prose work, a novel called The Vicar of Wakefield, written maybe 20 years before this, which was one of the most widely read short novels in 18th century.
Great. Well, I've got a question which Paul admits may be a very broad question, so I can pose it, but maybe it's something that can go on as we go through the series. And then Kelly has also said she'll try to think of a book with a fatal flaw for next time.
Okay, because we're wrapping up. So yes, let's hear the question that we might consider a wraparound for the future.
Why is deception so central to so much comedy? Is there a message that reality is not what it appears to be?
So I wouldn't go as far as to say that there's a message. I'd say there's a realization that reality is not what it appears to be. Hardly a week goes by that every one of us doesn't have an example of our misunderstanding in terms of comprehension, or misseeing or mishearing something, and that we have maybe unfortunate results, but often comic or trivial consequences to hearing, seeing, getting something wrong. when high school teachers teach their literature courses and say one of the great themes of literature is appearance and reality, of course they're right. For one thing, we appear to be reading a play about real people. They're not real people. I don't mean that they're not real people and that the characters on the stage. They are marks on a page. This novel is not an actual slice of life. It's a work of art. So I think it's in the nature of all literature about appearance and reality. It's especially imbued in drama because we are seeing someone saying he's Julius Caesar when we know he's not. He's my Uncle Ned. And so we have to suspend disbelief and imagine, for the sake of enjoying the play, not just respecting it, but we paid a ticket, we want to believe that's Julius Caesar. And so I think it's in the nature of literature that it is not what it appears to be. You may know the impressive, realistic painting of a pipe by René Magritte that has written in script underneath the pipe, Ceci n'a pas un pipe. He was Belgian, so he wrote in French. This is not a pipe. I hope some of you know that. If you don't know that wonderful painting, you could put Magritte pipe and you'd find it online. So it is a painting of a pipe that is absolutely realistic. There's nothing artificial looking about it. It's floating in the air, but it's a pipe. And in script in the painting, part of the painting is, this is not a pipe. And of course, what he means is, look how good I can create the appearance of a pipe. So realistic, you would think it's a pipe, but you and I both know it's not a pipe. It's an artificial pipe. It's artifice, it's art. And I have given a lecture, I don't think I've given it in Wilton, maybe I have, Literature and Life, in which what good art does is say, hey, come over here. Look at how realistic, look at how lifelike this play, this novel, this poem, this painting is. And then just when you start to get involved in its reality, the painting, the artist, the poem said, no, go back to life. This is just phony. This isn't real. Go back to doing what you're supposed to do. The idea is that art is a recreation, a recreating of life, a recreating of a pipe, a recreation of a group of characters in late 18th century England that will be recreation for us. I'm punning on the word purposely, that we not take too seriously. That's why we call it a play. Why do people play a part? Why not? Why don't we come with a word like act a part that's acting? Play. And the idea of play as part of what human beings need to be alive is very much connected to our interest in the pitfalls of appearance and reality and the joys of recognizing that things are not what they seem or may surprise us by being what they are.
Sounds great. By the way, Mark, you did do Literature and Life with us. It was in June 2020.
Yeah,
Our-
I figured I must have, because it's a talk that I thought your crew would like.
Yes,
Yeah.
and for everybody's benefit out there, that recording is on our YouTube channel. So if you go to
Oh my goodness.
oh yeah, so if you go to YouTube and you put Wilton Library streams in the search box, that'll bring you to our channel, and you're going to scroll through a lot of stuff because it was from 4 years ago. But if you want to watch that, you want to watch that
Ignore
lecture,
all the other stuff. Just get to my talk. Yeah. So
they're
I want
all
to say that I want to say it's my talk, so it's self-serving, but it's a good introduction to Mark Schenker's opinion about how to read literature. And I
yes.
mean that seriously. It's my view, but I think it's a good introduction to one way to think about literature.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, thanks everybody. That was very good. Great comments, great questions. And enjoy the evening. We'll see everybody in a couple of weeks for the next one of these funny plays.
And I'll just say as a PS, I hope your participation and the way you participated tonight will continue. I think it's better for the event. It's certainly better for me than trying to explain to you the plot of a play you've already read. I very much like that people were willing to share their thoughts and comments and questions. So thank you all. And again, thank you, Michael. Thank you all for showing up.
Great. Thanks, Mark. See you all in a couple of weeks.
And those of you who celebrate, have an easy fast. Thank you. Take care.
Yes. Okay. Good night. That's right. Good night, everybody.